Welcome and good afternoon. I'm Signa Mary McKernan, a vice president here at the Urban Institute of the Center on Labor, Human Services, and Population, and also a financial well-being expert. So today's topic is near and dear to my heart. Thank you to all of us who joined both in the room today and online. And before I jump in, here are a few notes on housekeeping. One, the event is being recorded, and the recording and relevant links will be posted online after the event. If you're joining us virtually, the live captions are turned on, and you can adjust those at the bottom of your screen. And if you're in the room, you can use the QR code that's on all of your tables to submit your questions, and the virtual audience can submit your questions directly into the question and answer box at any time. We're going to be sharing a link with a post-event survey, and we ask that you share your feedback with us. It's helpful for us and for panelists to hear what you're thinking about and to shape how we do events and what we look at in the future. If you'd like to join the conversation online on Twitter, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. Okay, so with the logistics behind us, I want to thank all of our speakers for joining us for a discussion of how climate change impacts household financial well-being. And we're going to be exploring both what drives the risks and also the pathways to building resilience. So far in 2023, the United States has suffered $23 billion disasters, many of them fueled by climate change. The increasing frequency, severity, and the cost of the disasters and the warmer temperatures is having an impact on people's financial health. We know that many families in the United States live paycheck to paycheck, and that disasters can push households into financial instability and distress. So it's imperative that we both consider climate in our policies and programs, and that we consider them when we're looking at those policies and programs aimed at both financial health and wealth. So this conversation today brings together both leading research insights and also the perspectives of federal agencies working at the intersection of climate and financial health. In a few moments, I'm going to be joined on stage by Steele, Assistant Secretary for Financial Institutions at the U.S. Department of Treasury. And we're going to discuss Treasury's work on climate change and American household finances. Prior to his role as an assistant secretary, he served as director of the Corporations and Society Initiative at Stanford's Graduate School of Business. And that's a research initiative that examines issues at the heart of markets, business, and government to promote more accountable capitalism and governance. So we're pleased to have him here with us today. And please join me in welcoming Assistant Secretary Steele. Great to have you. Thanks for coming.
Well, thanks, Signa. It's nice to be here. And thanks to Urban for letting us join them.
Okay, well, we often talk about climate in a variety of different contexts. And today you released a report, Treasury released a report, The Impact of Climate Change on American Household Finances. And so it's such an important intersection here of these two. Can you give us some background on the framework that you used in the report and why you chose that framework?
Sure. I think we all know we are seeing today up in New York, in particular, that events like wildfires, flooding, heat waves are, as you said in the opening, getting more and more frequent and more intense. We know that there's been at least a 5-fold increase in the annual number of billion-dollar disasters in the U.S. Going back to 1980, and that's even adjusted for inflation. We've had things like Hurricane Ian last year, where we had 157 people die, and the cost of that is estimated to be over $100 billion. So we are seeing the intensity and the impacts here, and as you noted, we released this report on the impact of climate change and the impacts on the American household today to try to get up close a little bit more, because we see these numbers. We see headline numbers around events like the wildfires in Maui, where we think they'll cost around $4 to $6 billion. We wanted to get a little bit more of a human face on these kinds of high-level events in these numbers, try to unpack what the impacts are to households. And maybe I'll take a step back for a moment, because some folks, in the 2 years I've been in the position that I'm in, sometimes I get like, why is the Treasury Department talking about climate change? Like, what does your agency have to do with all of this? But I would say, number one, the White House has told all the cabinet agencies that we need to take a whole of government and a whole of executive branch approach to climate. So all the agencies need to think about what our role is here, both in addressing the problems and then in creating solutions to address the challenges of climate change. And the Secretary herself has spoken repeatedly about the urgency of addressing climate change, both the cost and the toll that it imposes on the nation and the globe, but also thinking about what we can bring to bear as an agency to do that. So she's encouraged all of our offices to think what more we could be doing to both analyze the problem and then think about solutions. And so we've done work through the Financial Stability Oversight Council about looking at the broader risks of the financial system caused by climate change. I'm also responsible for the Federal Insurance Office, which we can talk a little bit about more about later, but obviously there are things happening in the property and casualty insurance markets as a result of climate change that we're looking at. But we, through our Office of Consumer Policy and through our partners in the Financial Literacy and Education Commission, really wanted to take a closer look at the household level and the individual level impacts of some of these events, to really think in particular about how they impact household level finances. So to go back, to the example of the wildfires, you can think about when that kind of event happens, what are the impacts on individuals on the ground? I mean, obviously there's the catastrophic loss of life that happens for folks that are exposed to the wildfires, but there are also people that do work on Maui who may now, their business may be closed down. They may be agricultural workers who now they can't go to their place of business anymore. So it's either not accessible or they've had their hours cut. So they're not getting income. At the same time, there might be costs related to relocation or rebuilding their home after the fact. There could be less access to resources on the island, which could lead to higher energy or food prices. And so that was really our goal with this report, was to try to really put the granular household level focus on some of these broader events where we see sort of the macro level impacts on the costs, but understand how it really reflects in people's day-to-day lives.
Yeah, so important to go, just see those total costs, but also the day-to-day lives on people. And I know that the report primarily focused on flooding, and that includes extreme weather events, sea levels rising, flooding related to wildfires, extreme heat. And research from my Urban Institute colleagues and others demonstrate that disasters from like this can have a long and uneven process in terms of both recovery and rebuilding after, and that it can be really unequal in how different people are affected. And I know the Treasury report also looked at the different impacts. What did you find there?
Yeah, so we tried to do a couple of things. I mean, one was just look at the broad impacts that climate change is having across all households. So for workers on a place like Maui, that kind of dynamic that I described, but you could have events in other places that create unsafe working conditions for all workers, regardless of what their household financial condition looks like. You could imagine events increasing the cost of healthcare, for example, on people, or the increased property destruction that happens with things like hurricanes. You can also look at the broad impacts of chronic climate change that is happening. This past summer was the hottest summer on record. What does that mean for workers that do work outside in the agricultural industry, in construction, and manufacturing, and things like that? But also, what does it do to energy prices to raise the cost of things like air conditioning? And so one piece of this is just looking about what are the ways this impacts all households? But then we really wanted to drill down on some of the most financially vulnerable households to better understand then what the implications would be for those folks. And so people like the folks in this room who do research on financial capability and well-being will be aware of things like the CFPB's 2021 survey that found that nearly 1/3 of households could not cover more than a month's worth of expenses if they lost their income, or those annual Federal Reserve surveys that say that over 60% of households could not even afford a shock $400 expense out of their cash and other available resources. And so that was one of the things we really wanted to look at, in addition to the broad impacts of climate change, were how does that get exacerbated when a household is financially vulnerable? And so, you know, we're in Washington. If folks were here this past summer, this is a thing I was very used to coming from California, but there was wildfire smoke from the Canadian fires here in Washington, D.C., even this past summer. You know, so again, agricultural workers, construction workers who don't want to or unable to inhale wildfire smoke, who then can't work. What does that mean if it creates unsafe conditions? What does that mean for low-wage workers? Households with health conditions who then are ingesting the smoke, who then have increased medical costs. What does that mean in terms of increasing their financial precarity? And then again, I think this will be a theme I return to repeatedly because of my dual roles with consumer policy and insurance, is the property damage that comes out of this for households that can barely afford to really absorb that kind of expense. And so, you know, that's what we're trying to do, is think about the broad impacts of climate change. What does it mean for the most vulnerable? And one section of the report that I would really recommend people take a look at is we tried to do a little bit of geospatial mapping to try to see where those communities are located, where those overlaps are really happening with respect to the three risks that you mentioned around heat, wildfire, and flooding. What we saw is that a little more than 50% of counties in the U.S. are exposed to the impacts of climate in one of these three different ways. And then you overlay the financial vulnerability on top of that, you see that there's about 20% of counties that have this overlay of exposure to climate change and financial vulnerability as well. And I think that's really important, you know, for someone who works in the federal government to understand that climate change is a global phenomenon and we are experiencing it at a national level, but also that different communities are experiencing this in very different ways, and to really try to understand where those pockets of those communities are, what they're experiencing, and then try to think about how we respond to that as well.
Yeah, that mapping is so important to help, like, where to target resources.
Yep.
You know, where do we go first, which is, I guess, what I want to turn to next, because we've talked a lot about the problems. You know, what about some of the solutions? What can we do here? How can we support, how is Treasury thinking about supporting states as they're looking at their policies and programs?
Sure. I wish this report had all of the solutions to all of the issues that we raise in it. Unfortunately, it's not that ambitious of a project. But yes, you're absolutely right. So Treasury does have a role to play to some degree in offering assistance to different kinds of businesses or state and local governments. So Treasury was given historic appropriations to administer through the Inflation Reduction Act to help communities with various different kinds of clean energy investments, to state and local governments, to individual households to invest in things like EVs and other kinds of heat pumps, other kinds of energy efficiency, and also think about how to invest in some of the technology and new products and services that might actually help to reduce the impact that some of these technologies are having on the climate as well. So that's an important part of it. You know, some folks, I think, were at the White House yesterday for the introduction of the National Resiliency Framework. That's another way that we can kind of try to get out ahead of this stuff. You know, and I think that's one piece of the report. We can talk a little more about the specific recommendations. Is about how households can be aware and try to protect themselves and think about the ways this is impacting them. But I think an important thing for policymakers in particular realize when they look at the impacts of climate change is some of these can be handled on the back end in terms of protections, but also there's a lot of upfront investment that has to happen in order to make communities and households more resilient. And at times, policymakers might not connect those two things and see the way that upfront resiliency investments might actually lead to some of these better outcomes in the back end when a consumer is really experiencing some of these things. An area where at the department we're trying to think about that is a third office of mine is the Office of Community and Economic Development. We've been trying to work in particular with community financial institutions to hear from them what kind of investment work they are doing to try to help address both the clean energy transition, but also make communities more resilient to the physical impacts of climate change. And then how can we partner with them to make that job easier as well? And so, again, consistent with what the White House has told the department and what the secretary has told us, we're really trying to think about all the different tools and how we could bring them to bear to address a lot of these really thorny problems.
Yeah, I just was thinking about your last mention of the financial institutions. I know that when the government went out with COVID relief checks, often the people who needed them the most got them last, and it's because they didn't have those connections to some of the mainstream financial institutions. So you've touched on so many different aspects, and there's so many different places to come in. I know the report touches on credit reports too, and what happens to credit and the price of credit. So that's great. In terms of, that's like state level programs. In terms of people, like what can people who are impacted by this, what resources might you point them to?
Sure, and part of this report is identifying some of the issues and problems for academics and policymakers to kind of pick up and think about how their work overlaps with some of the issues we're raising in the report. We can talk more about those pieces as well in a minute if you'd like. But also part of the report is trying to raise awareness for households about the challenges they might interact so they can equip themselves well, but also to tell them that they are not necessarily alone when they get into these sort of situations. I think probably when people experience catastrophic events, it can feel very isolating, and in particular when we experience financial vulnerability and precarity, that can feel even more isolating, like it is our problem to solve ourselves, that help is not available to us. But one of the messages the report is trying to get across to households is that there are actually resources available, that there are agencies like the ones that are joining us today, like HHS and FEMA and even the Small Business Administration, that have products, services, other tools to offer them when they get into when they're in these precarious situations. There are resources that they can actually draw on. There are things like the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. And there are also programs like LIHEAP, energy assistance when the cost of their energy bills go up. And so that's one of them. We're trying to do a few different things with the report, and that's one of them is make sure households are aware of some of the risks that are out there, but also let them know that they're not on their own. There are some resources available too, including from the federal government.
Yeah, good. And I know during the COVID crisis, we really expected financial health to take a huge dip. And certainly not everybody fared equally well, but the programs and policies in place meant that we didn't see that overall. Yeah. So right. It can really work. And then you mentioned we don't have all the solutions yet. We're laying out some of the research, and what additional knowledge or research do we need in order to get to and provide more of those solutions? Yeah.
I think there's potentially, we view this report as a first step, as I said, for additional policymakers, academics, other kinds of researchers to really hopefully pick up the baseline that we're laying out and take it in different directions depending upon what their interests are. I think some pieces of the report that stick out to me as being of interest that I'd love to see other stakeholders really drill down on. One is the kind of psychological impacts of these kinds of events, the confluence of the trauma of experiencing some sort of climate-related disaster, but then also the way that financial precarity and financial stress impacts people's psychological health and well-being, and kind of what that does to people's decision-making, how they respond and react in one of these situations. I think we know that a lot of financial behavior is emotion-driven in a lot of ways. But the stress of a climate event on top of that, and the threat of losing your home or your community, just sort of what that does to households, and then how, again, the role of policymakers in responding to those kinds of issues. It might be an individual personal issue, but surely there's a role for others to try to step in and try to help them navigate those kinds of situations. I think a second piece of this that hopefully the geographic aspect of the report might kind of tee up for others is how certain populations are impacted by these kinds of events, again, at the household and community level. we're looking at it from the perspective of financial precarity, but we know that financial precarity, certain communities are particularly impacted by financial precarity as well, and they might also be frontline and fence line communities now. And so really drilling down on the specific populations that are most impacted by climate change, and then the overlapping of financial vulnerability. And then I would be negligent, grossly negligent, if at any kind of climate discussion I didn't again mention the Federal Insurance Office and the work that it's doing. It is in early stages of piloting a nationwide zip code level data call for data on the pricing and availability of property and casualty insurance policies. I think a day doesn't go by that I don't read an article in like the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg about how insurance companies are either raising the cost of their premiums, reducing the coverage of their policies, or just saying they're not going to issue new policies in entire states or in communities as a result of climate change. What we at the department are very interested in is getting more of the underlying data about that, what we actually empirically know about how the costs of insurance are going up as a result of climate change, or how availability is being affected as a result of climate change. And we want it at a nationwide basis. I understand climate change is a global phenomenon that does not respect things like national borders, but we need it on a national scale. There are some states that are collecting some of this information, but they're not all doing it. Yeah. But we also need it at a granular zip code level, again, to understand the way that communities in particular are impacted by it. So I think those are a few different areas where would love to see additional support, research, conversations, but we really hope this is a conversation starter, not that we think we have all the answers in these issues.
Yeah, excellent. So lots of different avenues to go forward. Yeah. So with that, I'll say thank you very much, Assistant Secretary, for joining us today. And next, I wanted to introduce Andrew Rumbach, who's going to tell us. He's a senior fellow and co-lead of Urban Institute's Climate and Communities practice area, and we'll hear about some research. Thank you.
Hello. Well, thank you, and welcome to everyone to Urban, everyone here in the room, but also everyone who's joining us online as well. So as Signa Mary said, I'm Andy Rumbach. I'm a senior fellow at the Urban Institute, and I'm also the co-leader, along with Sarah McTarnahan, who you'll meet during the next panel, of our Climate and Communities program here. And so Climate and Communities it's a focused program of impact-driven research, technical assistance, policy analysis, and communication, all with the goal of helping change makers to build safer, more prosperous, and more resilient communities for all. Okay, so if anyone was skeptical that climate change was a pressing issue before 2023, I hope you send them this image that comes to us from scientists at the Climate Brink. This is daily temperature anomalies over the last 50 years or so. 2023 has been the hottest year on record by far, and it continues a trend that we've been seeing for a long time now. We just heard a lot of numbers about the numbers of billion-dollar disasters. Here's another number from you that gets talked about a little bit less. This is from the census. In 2022, 1.3% of all households in the US were displaced from their homes by a disaster. 15% of households in Louisiana in that year were displaced by a disaster. Just remarkable numbers when you start to think about the cumulative impact on people. And so we get lost in those numbers as researchers sometimes. What does that mean on the ground in the daily lives of people? Well, it's scenes like this, right? Folks who are escaping from 31 straight days of 110-degree temperatures in Phoenix and going to a local cooling center. These are people's lives disrupted. These are people's work disrupted. These are people's businesses disrupted. These are many unknown health impacts all in one photo, and we could have shown any number of thousands of photos just from this last summer. And so we know that climate change is an urgent problem, and elected officials, practitioners, community advocates, citizens, they all need high quality, reliable research to help them make decisions to deal with this urgent problem. And we think that Urban, along with our peer organizations, along with our university partners, we have a role to play in this larger climate challenge. And so What does Urban's research say about climate change impact on financial health and well-being? I'm glad you asked. Let me start, though, by saying this. So in the Climate and Communities program, this is a diverse group of researchers with a lot of different backgrounds, from economists to community planners. We have folks who are qualitative researchers, quantitative researchers. We talk a lot about what our shared beliefs are as researchers as we look at climate from all of these different angles. One of our shared beliefs that we've come up with is that climate change is an everything problem. It's not a silo over here. It's not FEMA. It's not one organization with the government. It's something we need to start thinking about climate change as a problem that touches on all of our lives, all of our work, and therefore we need this whole of government, whole of civil society, whole of community approach to dealing with it. And so in that spirit, and as I was trying to choose a study to really feature today from Urban, I couldn't do it because there's too many, and there's too many diverse everything kind of studies. And so I'm going to give you 7 studies in 7 minutes I have left, each with a headline finding. And then I will say all of these come from different researchers at Urban, different centers, different kinds of approaches. We'll have all of these links in the event page and also emailed to you afterwards. I hope this is a little bit of an appetite, it whets your appetite and you go and look at these studies in greater detail. So number 1, disasters lead to broad and often substantial negative impacts on financial health, right? We know this at a sort of a large level, but when we dig into the data, we start to see this, and these researchers are looking at all of these different measures of financial health and well-being, including credit scores, debt and collections, bankruptcy, credit card debt, mortgage delinquency. One of the most interesting aspects of this report, which is called insult to injury, is that they find that medium-sized disasters, and this is close to my heart as a researcher, we often call these low attention disasters. These are the kind of events that happen much more frequently, but often don't get a declaration or don't get major disaster assistance. Those can actually have the largest outsized impact on financial health and well-being. One point from that research, communities of color impacted by medium-sized disasters experienced a 31-point decline in credit scores after 3 years compared to 4-point declines in majority white communities, again, because of what the Assistant Secretary just talked about in terms of chronically stressed communities in terms of their financial health. Number 2, underinsurance is a key determinant of household rebuilding progress after the Marshall Fire in Colorado. This is a longitudinal survey effort led by the University of Colorado and the Colorado School of Public Health, along with researchers at Urban and Duke University, surveying households as they recover over the long term. And not surprisingly, but incredibly important, underinsurance has become the major issue in recovery. So what you see is most households were underinsured. They thought they had enough insurance to cover rebuilding, but they don't because of inflation, because of the price of building materials, because of the rapidly escalating cost of labor. And so as a result, high-income households who can fill the gap are recovering much quicker, and that shows up in the data, which you can read about in that report, and much more data about that disaster. Number 3, mobile home park residents suffer chronic climate impacts. Another shared belief that we talk about in our practice area is that invisibility matters a lot. The populations who are least visible in the data are often those who suffer the worst impacts of these events because it's hard to design policies for them. And so mobile home parks, to us, fits this perfectly. They don't show up in the census. Everyone who you talk to on the ground knows that they are a highly vulnerable population. They house 7 million people. 3 times as likely to be in poverty as homeowners, conventional homeowners, and yet we can't actually measure them in the census. We often have a hard time accounting for them in our emergency management plans. Several studies that you can find on Urban's website or linked to Urban's website talk about financial health being linked to, in many cases, this mobile home, which in reality is not mobile at all. Mobile homes barely ever move. They're actually stuck in place. And so these households who are often a very modest means often have all of their savings tied up in this home, and when a disaster strikes, oftentimes they're not insured, they can't get programs that work for them, they lose all of their financial assets, and then lastly, they tend to be in hazardous areas where they suffer these events again and again. Number 4, I lost count already. Migration after Hurricane Maria had no measurable effect on the financial well-being of receiving communities. This is a fascinating study, just published relatively recently. Encourage you to go look at it. It was funded by the National Academies. Researchers at Urban found, and were looking specifically at migration from Hurricane Maria to Central Florida, which is one of the main receiving areas. And they looked at the question of how would this rapid influx of Puerto Rican migrants, how would that both impact the financial services there, but also the larger financial health of the community. Well, they found that there were limited financial services, and these organizations struggled to ramp up and will continue to struggle over time. But due to a lot of really interesting work that's outlined in the report from government and from community-based organizations, overall, across multiple measures, this graph just shows credit scores, across multiple measures, they saw no impact on the receiving community, which means that it is possible to absorb these migrants, but, and again, this is another belief we have in the Climate and Communities program, place matters a lot. Central Florida is not everywhere, right? So what is it about Central Florida that allowed them to be healthy, absorb this population, and not suffer negative financial consequences? As a result, a lot of lessons for other potential receiving communities. Number 5. North Carolina's rapid rehousing program helped households with financial instability to find stable housing. This is a program evaluation that was just published online from researchers at Urban, and what they looked at is this really interesting and innovative program in North Carolina that helped 1,000 people who were living in post-disaster shelters who had been housing unstable before the disaster, either homeless or had been suffering from housing instability. What programs and services do you give them coming out of the shelters? They gave them a concentrated suite of services and financial assistance, and they found that upon exit, the households that they have data on, 85% exited to stable housing. And if you compare that with the number who were unstable and unhoused before, it seems to be a really interesting success. But in the report, there's also a lot of interesting benchmarks for other communities as they implement these kind of programs to think about, especially how long this took to implement and why it took so long is a really interesting question that we should learn from. Number 6, and these last two, in the spirit of positive, thinking about tools and solutions rather than just problems, although the last one was really a success story, I want to talk about a couple of really neat data tools that Urban has published that I think will be helpful. So first, I come from a disaster management, emergency management background, speaking to my brethren out there and sisterin out there. Oftentimes when we think about financial health and well-being, we're using very simple metrics like income and poverty rates. We're not thinking about it necessarily in as complex of ways as the experts in this room are today. This is a really fantastic tool from Urban where you can go look at any PUMA in the US, which is a geographic area from the census, and you can look across 10 different indicators of financial health and well-being. And from an emergency management perspective, why don't we go beyond just thinking about poverty and income to start thinking about how healthy are our communities from a financial perspective, how well could they manage a shock, how could we use this data to design better programs. Finally, we need tools to connect our social safety net programs to climate challenges. We have amazing social safety net programs all around the country that are often doing work way beyond their resources, and one of those is Head Start. And so this is a recent tool that was published by researchers and data scientists and communication specialists at Urban that allows you to go online and look at where are all the Head Start programs in the country, the density of Head Start as per the population, and then map that across a whole lot of different hazards, including not just climate hazards, but also things like legacy pollution. And it's a fantastic mapping tool. It covers the entire United States. It allows you to generate all kinds of interesting characteristics. And this is just an example of the kind of tools that programs across the federal government and state governments need in order to incorporate climate change into their everyday work. Like I said, I hope you will visit our website. I hope you will take a look at all of these individual reports and many others that are on Urban's website. And thank you again very much for being here and looking forward to hearing from our next panel.
Thanks for the game of musical chairs, exactly. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah McTarnahan, and together with Andy, I co-lead the Climate and Communities practice area here at Urban. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to all the panelists. Really looking forward to this discussion. As we've been seeing so far, there are many complex forces shaping the financial risk and resilience to climate, demanding a coordinated response across all levels of government, as well as nonprofit, private, community-based actors. So really excited to welcome this group on stage, representing 3 agencies with an important role in supporting families and communities, as well as a local, very practice-engaged researcher from Texas to speak to what's happening in one of the most climate-impacted states. So all their bios are available on the website. I encourage you to check them out. I will spare us the time, and on the QR codes if you're here in the room. So I just want to start by inviting each of the panelists to briefly introduce yourself and your agency's role in stabilizing households in the short and long term after disasters. Let's start with you, Natalie.
Great. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Natalie Grant. I'm the director of the Office of Human Services, Emergency Preparedness and Response at the Administration for Children and Families at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Long title, I know. Long title, very big role and capacity that we serve. We are basically consider us the safety net for the nation. We are the largest funder and provider of human and social services in the U.S. government. Our budget annually is $62 billion. We have a presence in every community across the country, and we factor prominently in some of the programs that you've heard earlier, from the direct services and assistance that come forward from temporary assistance to needy families, the low-income home energy assistance program, water assistance programs, and so on, to child and family services, child welfare, Head Start, child care benefits, foster care, runaway and homeless youth, to other social service programs and supportive entities such as domestic violence, trafficking in persons, and then community block grants. We are the smorgasbord when it comes to human and social services. And when it ties back into some of these climate risks and so on, we serve and support those persons, individuals, households, and communities that are at the margins and are in crisis every day. Right? That's why they rely upon our services and supports holistically. So our role in this is really to partner with our colleagues, especially in times of emergency, so that we're looking across the communities and especially at the margins, because we know that there are underserved persons that are more vulnerable to some of these shocks and threats holistically as they continue to expand and as we continue to understand climate risk across the country.
Right. Aaron?
Hey, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be with you today. I'm Aaron Levy. I'm the director of the Individual and Community Preparedness Division at FEMA, which means I have the best job in the agency, and I'm very proud to say that. So FEMA's mission, helping people before, during, after disasters, it's one of the noblest, I think, in government. For us, when we think about helping households in the aftermath of a disaster, a couple things come to mind. First off is our individual assistance program run by our friends in the Office of Response and Recovery, which in the case that should the president declare a major disaster declaration in concert with the governor or a tribal leader, FEMA has the ability, now I want everyone to listen carefully, both in the room and at home, to help folks with their immediate needs and their uninsured needs. That's key, and hopefully we'll talk about this a lot with the panel. The whole concept of the Stafford Act, which is the governing piece of legislation that governs disaster assistance, there's an assumption out there that the private sector, specifically private insurers, is taking on a majority of the risk. And what we've realized is, and what the Assistant Secretary talked about, and what Andrew talked about, is there are a lot of Americans who are not getting the assistance that they need. And that is not a knock on my colleagues or our previous colleagues who came before us. I can tell you that every FEMA employee, when they go to the field, would run through a wall to help an individual or a family after a disaster. What it's a realization is that our programs need to improve to meet the climate challenges of today. Second thing we're really focused on is the National Flood Insurance Program, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. And I'm going to give you a thought. 1 inch of floodwater can cost $25,000 worth of damage. Here's the other thought. Only 36% of Americans believe that their home insurance policy will cover flooding. It doesn't in most cases. And of all of the properties that's looked at that are in a floodplain, only about 4% are bought into the National Flood Insurance Program. So no matter what else you take away from me today, one of the encouragements that I also give folks whenever I give a talk like this, anywhere from a think tank in Washington to a bodega in New York City, I've done it. I always tell folks, if you can, talk to your insurer and buy flood insurance. And I know some of the things we'll talk about today is trying to get with people who might not have that ability. And the last thing I'll say is a bulk of what FEMA does, a lot of our programming focuses on response and recovery and supporting our state, local, tribal, and territorial partners. For my team in community preparedness, we're all about building financial resilience. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but most of all, to really think about, I'm going to leave you with a question to think about before it's my turn again. If I told you you had a minute to get out of your house, do you know where your home insurance information is, your driver's license, your bank account information, your mortgage information? Would you know where that is, especially if you left your phone in your house? We're going to talk about that more in a little bit. I'm looking forward to it. So think on it for a minute. We'll be back. Yeah.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Shannon Van Zandt. I'm a professor of urban planning at Texas A&M University and a senior fellow in their Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center. I've been studying social vulnerability to disasters and particularly the intersection of affordable housing and disasters for about 15 years, really since Hurricane Ike struck the Texas coast in 2008. A lot of people don't remember that because it happened the same week that the market crashed. But Hurricane Ike still stands as one of the top 5 or 6 most expensive storms in U.S. history. And it was my introduction to hazards. Before that, I was a houser. I studied the impact of homeownership on low-income families for my dissertation work, and then got into disasters when I came to Texas A&M. And over that period of time, my focus has really been on that intersection of where people live and what their exposure to hazards is. So in particular, I'm interested in land development patterns and our history of segregation and discrimination in the housing and lending markets that have perpetuated segregation over a period of time and how that places people in harm's way. I have a saying, and part of it's because I do study mostly hurricanes and flooding, but low-income people live in low-quality homes in low-lying areas. And that really captures that intersection between physical vulnerability, which is low-quality homes, social vulnerability, low-income people, and risk or exposure, which is low-lying areas. And so I have had an opportunity in Texas to study a number of disasters, as you might imagine. I've done a lot of work with community partners. I serve on the board of Texas Housers, which is a very important advocacy group, not just in Texas, but across the nation in terms of advocating for low-income residents to have adequate housing with a particular interest in disasters, since it is kind of a constant state of being in the part of Texas that I live in and most of Texas. So I've done work in the lower Rio Grande Valley of Texas, along the Texas-Mexico border, which is one of the highest poverty areas in the country. And I've also done a lot of work in the Houston-Galveston area, particularly in communities of color, both within the city of Houston and also in unincorporated Harris County. One of the interesting factoids that I like to mention about unincorporated Harris County is that about half of the population of the Houston metropolitan area is in unincorporated Harris County. And in Texas, there are no building codes outside of municipal jurisdictions, which means that we have about 500,000 people living in areas that have no building codes. And of course, when we have events like Hurricane Harvey and the flooding that was accompanied with it, the impact on our most vulnerable populations is tremendous. And a lot of my research has focused on what the long-term impacts through the recovery process for those households is, understanding that the housing types that are most likely to be occupied by socially vulnerable populations take much longer to recover, probably 2 to 4 times as long as regular single-family detached owner-occupied housing. And that it's much more volatile. And so we see that sometimes those homes never regain their pre-storm value, which of course is for many of those homeowners is their single most important asset that is not only not gaining equity during that period of time, but in most cases is actually losing equity during that period of time. Thank you. Susanna?
My name's Susanna Fritzberg. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Capital Access at the Department of Treasury, where I lead work on consumer finance and household finance. with a particular focus on financial inclusion and on addressing historic disparities. And I'll pause for just a minute because we're launching this report today to note that the report was produced with significant contributions from HHS, from FEMA, and I believe Sharon is cited several times in it. So this is such a unique group to have the chance to talk about these issues with, and I'm really grateful to Urban for facilitating this conversation. We see this as a significant initial contribution to Treasury's work with a household lens on climate change, and we expect that that'll move forward in a number of ways, including ways that focus on the household level and also the overall financial system. So as Assistant Secretary Steele mentioned, Treasury, of course, has a role in helping to mitigate climate-related risks more broadly in the financial system. There's activity led by the Financial Stability Oversight Council, the Federal Insurance Office. Treasury just released a set of net zero principles intended to help guide private net zero commitments. At the household level, though, I want to highlight a couple things. First, obviously, we know people need tremendous resources to recover from disasters and to build resilience. My colleagues here are a key part of ensuring that those resources reach the people who need them. There's an effort at Treasury around the implementation of the IRA, also representing transformative investments in preparing for climate change. We also need to recognize that alongside these resources and alongside some of the consumer-facing elements of the IRA, it's really crucial that households have access to the information and the financial education that can help them plan for the future and react to disasters. This report is part of that and part of the overall mission of the Financial Literacy and Education Commission, which, as I mentioned, consulted with Treasury throughout the production of the report. And I want to take one step further and just note, as Assistant Secretary Steele highlighted, in this report, there's a laser focus on how the intersection of economic and social vulnerability and exposure to climate hazard means that communities that have been historically underserved or subject to disparities are at disproportionate risk of physical and financial harm, even though they are not the communities that have benefited largely from the activities that drive climate change. So we know managing financial risk is not a new challenge, especially for low-income and underserved communities who are often extremely sophisticated budgeters, but it is an emerging risk. It's complex. It has both near-term and long-term challenges, and we think that it's a really crucial part of Treasury's work, not only to combat climate change, but also to advance equitable economic growth and opportunity, that we see that risk very clearly, and that we take action to build financial resilience with a focus on underserved households. And that leads us back to a number of the activities that Treasury leads in investing in communities, in working to expand access to credit and capital, in ensuring that people across America have access to the financial products, tools, and information that they need in order to meet their needs and their goals. My colleagues here know, and probably many of you in the room know, what it's like to spring into immediate action in the aftermath of a disaster. And I think the challenge for Treasury is to support and undergird that work with ongoing efforts to strengthen the long-term financial security of communities across the United States.
Great, thank you all so much for those introductions. I think we already got many facts that are vying to be the takeaway finding today. As we're going into the next set of questions, just want to invite everyone online and in the room to submit questions using the QR code or through the event platform. We're trying to save time to get to those, which will be arriving here. But Aaron, I want to turn to you to talk a little bit more about some of the impacts on the ground. What are some of the main drivers of financial burden for families in the wake of disaster? And then if you can think ahead to some of the kind of main individual, household level and community level actions that can be taken to support preparedness.
Sure, absolutely. So I think one of the drivers that we're seeing, obviously, is the insurance gap and the number of Americans who are both lacking home insurance and flood insurance. I think that's number one. And as I mentioned before in my remarks, the current system, and I use that word carefully, is very much dependent upon and designed upon the premise that the private sector will take on most of the risk. And that is something that I know we're going to be working with our interagency partners, and we've already have been in this administration, to mitigate that risk and help reduce those challenges. I think that's number one. Another challenge is, and I'll be very frank with you, it's not easy at the moment to navigate the federal assistance process. And one of the things I know that our Administrator Criswell, under the leadership of Secretary Mayorkas and President Biden, have been working towards is we're finally have started work on a consolidated system through which Americans can apply for disaster assistance. So you might be familiar with the disasterassistance.gov, but to your average family, when you're told initially that you're going to be going to SBA to get a no-interest loan as your first entry point for your uninsured needs, if you're someone who doesn't deal with the government, or you're only dealing with the government as your postman or receiving a Social Security check, I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty odd to me. And I think what we're trying to do now is work with our partners to be able to explain that process better and to streamline those operations to make it easier on folks. Pivoting to the question about what households can do, one of the things that I always tell my staff is this: when we're developing programming, because that's what my team does, in the individual and community preparedness space, I tell them that the person I want you to keep in mind is the person coming back from an overnight shift at a public hospital, who's working an hourly job as a nursing assistant. They live in unincorporated Harris County. I added that one. They live in a floodplain. They live in a mobile home that, as Andrew said, that's not actually mobile. What program can we design that is inclusive of that person? And what we think about is this idea of financial resilience is simple steps that individuals can take. I know the Assistant Secretary touched upon this a little bit. If you are able to organize your key financial information before an event happens, I guarantee you it's going to make your recovery a whole lot better. That's, I think, so important. So FEMA, in conjunction with Operation Hope and the Treasury Department, we have something called the Emergency Financial First Aid Kit. You can download it on ready.gov. And also, thanks to the leadership of Secretary Mayorkas, on the FEMA app, we have a digital wallet that you can literally go into, and you can take photos of those key documents and upload it to cloud computing. And even if you lose everything, it's saved on your cloud, so you can access that information. All of us at FEMA are dual-hatted. I have two jobs. I have my day job here in Washington, and I'm part of one of our National Incident Management Assistance teams. And when you're getting a disaster recovery center set up, when you have all of the interagency and nonprofit and private sector partners there, people are walking in with nothing. And it's often their first interaction with government. And when they walk in with nothing, the folks that have that data organized, they're going to have they'll be able to jumpstart the recovery. Last thing I'll say is I surely want to hear from my colleagues is under this administration, we have taken monumentous steps to invest in communities. First off, as some of you just heard, just recently, we announced the implementation of the Community Disaster Resilience Zone Act. Very excited about this. This is intended to build disaster resilience across the nation by driving federal interagency partnerships, public and private resources, specifically to underserved communities that are especially vulnerable to natural hazards. We've already just announced last month, 483 of the initial tranche of community disaster resilience zones, and there's more to come. And the way to think about this is we went right down to census tract data. I could spend hours up here nerding out about census tract data. I think I'm amongst friends. To look at the places at the highest risk across the nation. And the idea is to put a laser focus on these communities so they can be to really get the primary benefit of this designation, to get access to additional funding and technical assistance. We're really excited about this. A lot of government agencies talk a lot in talking points about public-private partnerships. This is taking it to a whole new level. This is a joint effort with our interagency partners, the philanthropic world, and the private sector, as well as the nonprofit sector, to start to identify these communities so we can have that laser focus of the billions of dollars of grant funding and the technical assistance needed so we can change outcomes for the folks that are behind. So that answered your question.
Great, thank you, Aaron.
Yeah.
Natalie, I want to follow up pulling on some of the same themes of equity, and HHS has a real focus on low and moderate income populations, as you mentioned. So if you could tease out a little bit some of the specific needs that you all observe in responding post-disaster in these communities, and then how should we be thinking about kind of program design and implementation to be mitigating the disparities, not furthering them through our work?
Yeah, and I think I'll start with the second question first.
Yeah.
And my colleagues have alluded to this, and our federal programs just are not designed to support historically underserved, marginalized communities, folks that are in the margins, full stop. And I think therein lies a lot of our challenge, because our human and social service partners, they are working with runaway and homeless youth, individuals who are not emancipated from their parents. They don't have documents, right? They don't know how to navigate many of these systems and services. Or if you are a survivor of domestic violence or otherwise, there are these unique challenges of individual circumstances that are not fully appreciated by the sort of mean, right? Because they are necessarily outside the average for whom many of our programs are designed to serve and support. So honestly, our human and social service provider community, that community has really challenged us to say, let's take an equity lens to our disaster approach and to our disaster programs. Let's critically analyze and understand these human and social services and how they're being delivered on a day-to-day basis, such that we can bring them and really utilize them in a targeted fashion to complement these programs and services. It's not a this or that, it is oftentimes this and that. If I am a renter or if I am someone who is a couch surfer, the programs and systems may necessarily present a barrier to me. So at HHS and at ACF specifically, we are looking at how our programs and services can be utilized through waivers and flexibilities that really equip the service providers to take immediate action, right? We want to make sure that they can reach out and touch that community that they're already serving and supporting, and also to let them know that they can take more action within the confines of the resources and tools that they have available to them. I would note that even Congress recognizes the role that ACF plays. Since 2005, we've received many disaster supplemental appropriations to the tunes of hundreds of millions and billions of dollars through our routine programs and services. So that indicates to me that there is an acknowledgement, awareness, and understanding that these are critically important, and that the need for these underserved and marginalized communities is increasing. And part of what we really want to layer in there is how are we allocating and assigning our funds such that we don't supercharge inequity, right? Who are we seeing? Who are we hearing from? Who are we not hearing from, most importantly, so that we can really look and understand and then tailor our programs and services to address and tackle that need as opposed to what we think may be the need.
Great, really appreciate that. And the focus on resource coordination and thinking about how our disaster response programs come together with our safety net programs, and not always easily, right? And so maybe I'll shift with that in mind to Shannon to speak a little bit to what you're observing on the ground. So much of your work, as you mentioned, focuses on affordable housing and the experience of people post-disaster with displacement and other issues. So I'm wondering if you can just invite us in a little bit to that work. What are you hearing from community partners about these issues and the connection to financial health?
Well, I really appreciate what I've heard from our other speakers, and I think one of the things that Natalie said that really struck me is renters as a less attended to population. And you know, renters make up almost 40% of our population, and in some in urban areas it may be even more than 50%. Houston, for example, has is 50% owners, 50% renters, and we know that the majority of our disaster recovery programs are aimed at owner-occupied housing, and that is missing out on one of our most vulnerable populations. And it's a large vulnerable population. It's not marginalized. It's actually quite mainstream. And we've seen very little attention to renters in particular. And one of the things that we saw, particularly after Hurricane Harvey, was these renters and even renters even of single family homes, but certainly renters of multifamily and places like that, who are very precariously situated financially. Like we mentioned earlier, I think Assistant Secretary Steele mentioned earlier, these families who are living paycheck to paycheck. When a disaster comes and your transit is rendered useless, you can't get to work on time, you may lose your job immediately. And even if you don't lose your job, you can't get to it, so you're not getting paid. And the loss of even a single paycheck or missing work a handful of times can be the difference between surviving and not surviving for a lot of these families. And so definitely some of the community partners that I work with in Houston, we're really trying to address those kinds, to keep people from sliding further down the ladder. These are folks who've been struggling to climb the ladder, doing all the right things, maybe even saving money, but it's not enough. It's not enough to deal with even the $400 expense that for many of us would be, oh, sure, I can write a check for $400. But even in things like Winter Storm Uri, which Texas, I experienced, I was without power for many days. It was not a huge deal, and this often gets overlooked because our state government doesn't like to talk about it, but somewhere between 250 and 700 people died during that winter storm, which is much greater loss of life than what we would normally see even in a hurricane in Texas. People who literally froze to death. And then even when the power is on, the utility bills are ridiculously high. I know we've mentioned Phoenix with 30 days over 110. My community at College Station, we were 60 days of 105, 60 consecutive days of 105 or greater, with people not air conditioned, or people not having heat during Hurricane Uri. So the financial realities for many of these families really become a life or death situation. And I think of resilience, and this goes back to I think what Natalie was saying. When I think of resilience as a community planner, I think of it as a community level characteristic. And in my mind, what we should be doing is aiming all of our programs at those most vulnerable people. Because I think of resilience as like if you have a chain and one link is broken, then the chain doesn't work. And so we have a lot of those broken links in our communities. And we can become more resilient as a community by targeting our resources to that link that needs to be fixed. And that means that our program should be targeting our most vulnerable, and then everyone else will be addressed by them, but they really need to be getting to those who are most at risk of loss of life and loss of stable living.
Thanks so much, Shannon. I want to ask one follow-up question. There's been this theme around insurance that we've all been speaking to, and many of the questions we received in advance covered that as well. And I'm just curious what you're observing on the insurance front, in particular around some of the coverage and uptake issues, not necessarily the cost, which is a whole different issue.
Right, and I think one of the other things I wanted to mention too is about rural communities. I think we've mentioned a lot, and I know that you're excited about the census tract. As a planner, I really want to drill down to the block group. And part of the reason for that is that there is so much variation in communities within a county, within a tract. There's a lot of variation, and in rural areas, those tracts, of course, can be enormous and don't do a lot to target the particular communities. But so many of those homeowners are, they've paid off their mortgage, and so they don't have to have insurance, and they don't. I remember one family in Galveston, when we were studying Galveston, it was she was a small landlord. So she owned her home, and then she rented the house next to her that she owned. So she owned both homes, but she had a mortgage on the one that she rented. She had paid off her own home, so she did not have homeowner's insurance, but she did on her rental unit. And that was, I had never thought of something like that when we ran across it, and it just reminded me that it's great that she may be able to rebuild one of those homes, and that may be the one that she ends up moving into or whatever, but then she's lost one of her major streams of income that she can't reproduce. And so that coverage issue and recognizing, I don't know what the coverage rates are in Texas, to be honest with you, but I imagine that particularly in these rural areas, and older neighborhoods, of course, where a lot of the homes have filtered down, and so they are more affordable, and we're talking about older homeowners, that they're not insured. I have one friend, actually, I lived with a woman right after I graduated from college, my roommate's mother, who lives along Grays Bayou in Houston, and her home has been flooded at least 4 times in the last 10 years. And she refuses to move, to the point that her daughter, who was my roommate, and she are not speaking to one another anymore because they're tired of digging her out. Her son literally had to break the hole open in the roof for them to be saved after Hurricane Harvey. And not because she's not well educated, she's perfectly well educated, and not because she's poor, she's not. She's stubborn and she's old and she's connected to her community. And so I think sometimes, especially when we talk about relocation, we take for granted the importance of that connection to community and all of the other services that are provided to families beyond just their housing unit and their household. And that's something that a lot of our programs don't address very effectively.
I so appreciate that attention on challenging and pushing some of our assumptions and bringing in those personal experiences. So Susanna, I want to turn to you and on that theme of our assumptions and what might surprise, and to bring us a little bit deeper into the report that Treasury just released today. What was a finding that stood out to you or surprised you?
I want to start by commenting a little bit on what's been said so far. And we talk about vulnerable communities, we talk about underserved communities, communities that experience disparities, and I think there's a temptation sometimes to see those as real edge cases. But this represents a lot of America. This is a tremendous number of people. If you look, taking kind of the financial security, financial well-being lens, if you look at the metric of who's able to meet a $400 expense, there's a shockingly large number of people who can't. And if you look at self-reported indicators for whether people feel financially stable, that shrinks even more dramatically. So I think the principle that Sharon mentioned around sort of designing with vulnerable folks in the center is an extremely important one, but one that I think also encompasses really a tremendous number of people and not kind of small isolated examples. Returning from my point of personal privilege, I want to give you actually 2 answers to that question. And the first one ties in with a theme that's come up several times around connections between disaster relief and the social safety net. And we found in the report, one of the areas of financial impact that we highlight is the impact of climate events on the availability of childcare and education. And we find, relatively unsurprisingly, that extreme heat in particular can have big consequences for the provision of childcare and education, which means not only that students and teachers and other professionals might be experiencing unsafe conditions while they are at work or while they are in school, and conditions that interrupt the ability of students to learn, but also providers and schools often are forced to close. And if we look at the past decade, heat-related school closings in the US have nearly doubled, and we have every expectation that that will continue to rise. So this is obviously an issue that's exacerbated by outdated school infrastructure, very much exacerbated by the need for comprehensive childcare funding that can better support providers and also avoid family budgets being impossibly squeezed in trying to afford childcare in the first place. But there are significant consequences in the near and in the long term. Children face learning interruptions, parents have to scramble to find a place that they can take their kid, and many parents, and in particular many women, are likely to miss work to care for children, and that has obviously kind of direct income loss potential, but also has the capacity to interrupt equitable workforce participation and career advancement opportunities. I want to switch gears to a almost entirely different issue, having said that, to highlight something that unfortunately is all too common in the aftermath of disasters. As my colleagues have mentioned, disaster aid plays such a crucial role in recovery, but one extremely disheartening issue is the escalation of fraud and scams in the aftermath of disasters. Fake charities, fake job opportunities, impersonation of FEMA representatives, HHS representatives, other government agencies, impersonation of a financial institution. You know, to give an example, right, you could have someone who's experienced property damage. They get an email. It seems to be from FEMA. There's aid available. You just have to pay this application fee. They are trying to move quickly. It's complex. They go ahead and do that, and that was fraudulent. FEMA's not going to ask you to pay an application fee for aid. Now you find yourself in the position of not only sustaining direct impact from the disaster, but also having taken potentially a significant financial hit and the loss of private information that could impact you down the line. Scams like these are not, not only preying on the vulnerability of households in a particular moment in time, but it can have compounding effects as one more thing associated with a disaster that can bring someone down in kind of a negative financial spiral. And we've seen, I think the stat is that in the last 2 or 4 years, reported fraud and identity theft is up over 60%. And I think that probably also reflects some changes to reporting. But that's hugely significant. We know older adults in particular are aggressively targeted here. And I know my colleagues are very vigilant on this issue, but I think it's important that we continue to raise awareness about it, and that we think about the kind of partnerships that have been discussed here today with trusted community organizations, with folks on the ground who can do a good job of ensuring that people who are already in a vulnerable situation don't get taken advantage of again.
Great, thank you. So we've been focusing a lot of our conversation in moments like the one depicted in this picture of kind of that post-disaster context. But I wanted to invite each of you to briefly, maybe a minute each, to just talk a bit to what we should be doing on quote-unquote blue sky days ahead of some of these climate impacts to proactively improve community and household financial resilience. Natalie, can I start with you?
Sure. I think as we learn and understand the tapestry of a community, right, and who has access to goods and services, and then also in advance of, for those notice incidents, what gives them agency, right? And I think at the present moment, there is very much this, we're going to set up these shelters and those sorts of things, which are prudent and important. And if I can advance benefits, if I can give you more agency, more opportunity for you to opt into what is the best decision, how do I do that? And how do I pursue that? And how do I implement and action that? We've seen that from COVID-19 with the childcare subsidies and so on, that people, on average, they make the right decisions, right? Just as we heard that folks are good budgeters, especially if they're low income. So I think part of our focus is on how do we really start to restore agency to many of these communities and really equip them with those schools, with those, not only those tools and sort of techniques, but also the resources that they actually need to make those best determinations and see where those things shake out. Separately, I would say, making sure that there's some portability. If people have to relocate, make it less burdensome for them to do so, because that is also a barrier to their movement and making the best available sort of determinations.
Thank you.
I love that term agency. And I think it's so important when folks here in the Beltway talk about how to build resilience in communities outside the Beltway. So I want to applaud that and really hammer that home. A couple comments. In addition to the financial resilience and insurance points I hit on earlier, I cannot begin to stress the importance of community-based organizations during both blue skies and gray skies. And one of the things that we've seen through research is a lot of these institutions, from food banks, nonprofit medical providers, credit unions, senior care centers, these are the institutions, and including our faith-based partners, where many underserved Americans depend upon those services day in and day out. We developed a training called Organizations Preparing for Emergency Needs, or OPEN. And the goal of this training is to help those specific CBOs or community organizations understand their supply chains, get a better understanding of how to build a continuity plan, and take these other basic steps and give them directions about where resources are available to do that. I never forget going to do this training to a small nonprofit, and they say, Aaron, I'm only one person with 5 volunteers. How am I supposed to build a continuity plan? So we're trying to make sure that we can marshal resources to them. Because I've always been somewhat surprised from where I sit that in this world of just-in-time delivery, many local food banks are only keeping 1 to 2 days of excess supplies available. And when that need is going to jump by 100, 200, 300%, we want to be able to give them resources to make that more resilient. The next thing that I would say is, the Assistant Secretary touched on this. I know I only got a minute, so I'll be super fast, is this idea of emotional, social, and physical resilience. Financial resilience is important, but I'm sure many of you have read the recent article about David Brooks about why Americans are so mad or why we're so sad in the Atlantic. And one of the things I know FEMA is going to be working on is this idea of personal resilience, about steps we can take with our federal interagency partners and as well as nonprofits to try and make a little bit of an impact. Perfect is the enemy of good in disaster management, my friends. To try and help Americans rebuild that physical, social, and emotional resilience. Because the last thing I'll say is, according to our National Household Survey, only 8% of Americans participated in a community event to help them build resilience over in 2023. That's a number we need to get up, and we need to do that by working together. Thank you.
I think I would challenge us maybe not to think about it as blue sky and gray sky, especially in my experience in Houston, and not to say that Houston is the center of the world, it may be the center of my world, but Houston is a constant state of disaster. I tell this story a lot. When Hurricane Harvey hit, I pulled up the city of Houston's website to see what emergency programs they were standing up, and I found that they had just stood up the one for Harvey, but they had 3 other ones that were still open, from Hurricane Ike, which took place 9 years prior, as well as the 2015 floods and the 2016 floods. So they had 4 open emergencies at that time. What that tells me is that they're always in a state of an emergency, and I think especially for our vulnerable families, they are constantly in a state of recovery, particularly because it takes them so much longer to recover in the first place. So anything that we can do to make them more resilient for life is going to be useful during a disaster as well. So as a planner, I want to say to communities that they should be planning for disasters. They should include vulnerability assessments in their comprehensive plans. They should include pre-disaster recovery plans as part of their comprehensive planning. And they should integrate all of the planning documents that they have across the community, including the hazard mitigation plan, the consolidated housing plan, the economic development plan, the comprehensive plan, and whatever other plans that they happen to be making, because so often those are in conflict with one another, and they're being developed in isolation from one another. We can only be successful and I'm a planner, so I really do believe that we have to think ahead, and we have to understand what is potentially happening to us. Sometimes I even get frustrated with seeing these pictures, because these are the pictures of what captures the nation's attention. But they're really just the beginning for these families that are experiencing them. These families are going to be working for months and years to get back what they had. And so we need to remember that period of time, and not just this immediate, what do we do today kind of reaction.
I'll try and go quick. I want to comment on so many good things that were just said. First, let me just, I think, underline planning. I started my career in local government. We had a major storm one year, and the mayor turned to me and said, "Your job is to keep our unsheltered homeless people alive." And we didn't have a plan to do that. We figured it out. We managed not to lose anyone, which reflects tremendous work from a number of community organizations. But for me, it really highlights the importance of communities thinking both about what can happen and also about what I would think of as one of the absolutely most vulnerable communities as they conduct their planning. I also want to underline the comments around agency. Treasury has a lot of ongoing work on financial inclusion, and we really are thinking about centering how we center agencies and center agency, consumer agency, as part of that work. There's a number of research projects that will be additive and useful going forward. I know Andy outlined several of them. And then let me close by just underlining again the point of investing in communities in a way that is community-led. Communities have been at the forefront of challenging climate change, of organizing to reduce local sources of pollution or organizing around local environmental or climate change goals. And I think there's tremendous potential for especially the wave of investment that is coming through a number of the Biden administration's initiatives to be directed in ways that takes advantage of significant community expertise. And it's certainly my hope that that's what we will see, and I know my colleagues are working hard to make sure that's the case.
Great, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our speakers and our audience for joining. As a reminder, the event was recorded, so it's available on our website for you to share with any others who might benefit from the dialogue. And I hope this is kind of an invitation for all of us for more dialogue, insights, and action to build resilience for households and communities to weather the financial impacts of climate change. I certainly walked away with new ideas and a renewed sense of urgency, so I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.